It's not going to surprise most of you when I tell you that we are living in a highly polarized country. Over the past several decades, the median Democrat has become increasingly liberal, while the median Republican has become increasingly conservative. This has led to a shrinking middle ground and an inability to make progress on important policy issues. One of the most polarizing policy issues is climate change. As you can see from this chart, over the past few decades, the gap in level of concern about climate change between Democrats and Republicans has diverged dramatically. This lack of bipartisan agreement has led to a total lack of meaningful policy progress on climate change and the inability of our country to agree on how much we should be prioritizing this issue. Part of the problem here is that we are stuck. We are stuck thinking about this issue through the lens of our partisan identities, through the viewpoints of our identities as Democrats and Republicans. But in reality, the issue is so much more multifaceted. It's more than a political issue, and understanding this might be the key to breaking down the partisan divisions on climate change. Growing up, I moved around a lot. At a particularly pivotal time in my life, I moved from the very liberal Pacific Northwest to a much more conservative part of the South. And once I made that move, I found that people in both places were very dismissive of each other, primarily because they differed in their political identities. But in reality, people in these two places shared many more identities. Many of those identities were much more important to them than their political identities, from their religious identities to being outdoor enthusiasts. I found that people in these two places shared a lot more common ground. Later, as I was studying this seemingly insurmountable political divide on climate change, I remembered how multifaceted people are. And I started to wonder, how might recognizing that people have many different aspects to their identities be part of the solution to breaking down this political divide? To demonstrate what I'm talking about, I want to introduce you to 3 people that I've met through my research on this issue across the country. The first is Don. Don's a soybean farmer in Illinois. He's a father of 3 and a leader in his local community. He's also a member of his county's Republican Party and the Illinois Soybean Association. Then there's Deborah. Deborah is a retired nurse in North Carolina. She has been politically conservative her entire life, but even more importantly, she's an avid birder. She spends all of her free time in her local woods looking for new bird species and is a leader in the local chapter of the National Audubon Society. And finally, there's Cheryl. Cheryl's a mother of 3, living in the suburb of Cleveland. She's active in her PTA and her local church. So what do these 3 people have in common? They seem to be living different lives, have very different day-to-day lived experiences. Well, over the past few years, all 3 of them have become active advocates for climate change and clean energy policies because of threats to important parts of their identities. You can think about identities as the way that we think about ourselves and the roles that we play in the world. Identities are important because we know from psychological research that they are among the most powerful drivers of human attitudes and behaviors, especially political attitudes and behaviors. Identities are also not unidimensional. We all have many different aspects of our identities that become more or less salient, or more or less likely to drive our attitudes and behaviors depending on our context. For example, me speaking to you today, my identity as a scholar or a researcher is highly salient, driving certain attitudes, certain behaviors. But when I'm at home, my identity as a caretaker or as a community leader might become more salient, driving different attitudes and different behaviors. Recognizing the multifaceted nature of identities and the important role that they play in driving our political attitudes and behaviors is part of the solution to breaking down this partisan divide on climate change. So let's check back in with our research subjects. Don, as I mentioned, he's an active Republican, but even more importantly, he is a farmer. And over the past few years, he's noticed changing weather patterns that have impacted his crop yields and made it more difficult for him to provide for his family. He recognizes that climate change threatens his identity as a farmer and his family's way of life. And this has led him to become an advocate for clean and renewable energy throughout his region. Looking at Deborah, a few years ago, Deborah read a report done by the National Audubon Society that found that 2/3 of bird species in North America are threatened with extinction by the year 2100 because of climate change. This includes Deborah's favorite bird, the brown-headed nuthatch. Recognizing the existential threat that climate change poses to birds and Deborah's birder identity, she now uses this as an entryway to talk to her friends and neighbors about supporting climate change policies. And then finally, there's Cheryl. Cheryl's never been particularly politically active, but at a recent PTA meeting, she attended a presentation by a member of the organization Moms Clean Air Force. This is an organization that unites parents in support of climate change and clean air policies for the sake of their children's generations. After hearing that presentation, Cheryl started to view the issue of climate change not through the lens of her political identity, but through the lens of her identity as a parent. This has led her to become a climate change activist herself, joining the organization Moms Clean Air Force to fight for climate change policies across the country. So for all three of these individuals, their attitudes and their behaviors towards climate change shifted once the issue was related to an important part of their identity. And this might be part of the solution to overcoming that partisan divide on climate change. If we can identify more identities that are threatened by the issue of climate change and develop communication strategies to help people view climate change through the lens of those alternative identities, we might be able to break down the partisan divides and build bipartisan support for urgent climate change mitigation policies.